Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Mariki Boertes. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Luxembourg in the ECT Center, Interdisciplinary Center for Security, Reliability and Trust, where I work in the IRIS group. I'm also an honorary research associate at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where I specifically lead the research aim on the DSI, Data Science Initiative Africa project, on geospatial data and how to use geospatial data for health emergencies. So this is a little bit about my background and why I'm talking to you today about using geospatial data to improve specifically environmental justice in Africa. So coming from the background of global biodiversity and environmental justice, as we move away or further and further away from the equator, the biodiversity diminish. And as you can see on the graph on your left-hand side, all the red and orange bits is the biodiversity that's clearly centered around the equator. And as you move away, it diminishes more and more and more. Which is interesting, or ironically, is that most biodiversity also falls within the poorest countries. They have the richest pools of biodiversity. But similarly, they also face the most burdens of conserving this biodiversity or protecting it, regardless of their lack of resources. In addition, they also need to fight issues such as biopiracy and navigate their way in between intellectual property thickets and intellectual property control. Also, with regard to food production, to ensure agricultural quality and food security, the exchange of plants and genetic resources are also very important. So you can see that there's a lot of economic burdens on poor countries with regards to biodiversity and the protection and the development thereof. Biodiversity is also impacted by climate change and more specifically heat, which I'm going to focus on today. So during the past 100 years, there were two significant periods of global warming between 1910 and 1945, and then again from 1976 onwards. And it's interesting to note that during the second period of warming, the rate of warming was double that of the previous period. So it's clear that heat is becoming a very serious problem, and we will see how and why. It's also estimated that the global mean temperature will increase by 4.3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which is quite an increase if you look at the sensitivity to heat of certain species, plants, and humans. This in general means that the ice caps are melting, sea levels are rising, but it also causes extreme weather conditions, including storms and droughts and crop failures. This weather conditions necessitated species for purposes of survival, to alter their behavior, to move to literally greener pastures, to adapt to their environment, or if they can't do that, ultimately go extinct. So what are the effects? Planting and harvesting dates has been recorded for years and years and years, and more specifically and very meticulously, the grape harvests, for instance, in Europe, the cherry blossoms in Japan. But since the early 1900s, significant changes were seen with regards to the records of planting and harvesting and etc. dates. People noticed earlier harvest, they noticed earlier breeding, the earlier arrival of migrant birds, species moving to better conditions or who expanded their ranges of where they live or don't live. And with regards to mountains, the tree lines and even the breeding ranges moved upslope. So one could see a systematic trend over decades and decades where spring started earlier and earlier and earlier, which clearly impacted on things such as breeding. So how does this climate situation affect biodiversity? Species interact with the entire ecosystem, and species differ in their physiological responses and their abilities to adapt or to move to places better to survive. However, not all adapt equally fast. So it's not entire ecosystems that can move from one place to another. It's rather species that move out of the ecosystem to somewhere else where they, as individuals, can survive. So if this happens, the ecological synchrony is disturbed. There's literally a mismatching of species that's supposed to show up and serve as food sources for other species that ultimately, if they don't show up, influence breeding and the survival of the other species. If species are able to move, they may not have anywhere to go. And this is the result of human activity, urbanization, built environments, which will ultimately also maybe lead to extinction. So the main reasons for extinction is that evolution rates are too slow to keep up with climate change. The exploitation of natural habitats of species, habitat degradation and change, and habitat loss. One of the biggest issues is specifically with regards or around to the equator and in Africa as well is tropical deforestation due to palm oil, soya, beef and leather, paper and timber. So you may ask, why does extinction matter in the context of biodiversity? Entire ecosystems and their functions and services depend on biodiversity. And there's a little sketch that shows you just in an urban setup how important a tree, for instance, is to keep the ecosystem balanced and the services that the tree provides with regards to an urban environment in place. So even the loss of a small proportionality of biodiversity impact ecosystems and their functions and services. On the graph you can see on the slide, you can see the orange or the reddish indications. That is Africa's tropical areas that hold some of the densest biodiversity and highest carbon recycling rates. So you can see the vast area and how important it is for biodiversity. And if those areas are being deforested, how it can impact rainfall patterns, which will ultimately influence agriculture and food production, which is an absolute necessity for Africa with regards to food security. So luckily, we live in an era where we develop a lot of technologies. And the question is, how can we use technologies to evaluate climate hazards? At the moment, we can map carbon emissions, for instance. We have online satellite images analysis. We can use small area drones, camera traps, sensors, mobile devices, which is successfully used in rural farming these days. And we can use to support sustainable development goals. The problem, however, is these technologies are fantastic, but how do you translate the data, the geospatial data that these technologies generate and collect to inform people on the ground of how they can use it and what they can use it for to ultimately enhance or protect biodiversity, or as in the case where I do research for the DSI Africa Law Project, how they can use it to prepare for health emergencies. So on this screen, you can see the use of big satellite data for crops classification and mapping, how you can see where crops grow better and which crops grow where, so that you can manage agriculture in that way. But it's not just climate and it's not just species. There's also socioeconomic applications of geospatial data. This is the case when earth sciences and social sciences combine. This happens when you can evaluate climate risks with regards to the displacement of entire populations. When these extreme weather conditions we've seen before becomes disasters, like flood disasters, hurricanes, extreme drought conditions, where people need to be evacuated or are displaced in huge numbers. These disasters expose people, and not only people, it also expose infrastructure, agriculture, farmlands, and ultimately their livelihoods. So one needs to predict with regards to entire populations and the society, their vulnerability to these climate catastrophes, so to speak. And vulnerability in this context involves the predisposition of persons or places susceptible to hazards or disasters. And then, if you can evaluate these issues, you can work towards an adaptive capacity or a strategy how to manage people and areas to the best of your ability. So on this graph, you can see how a geographic information system and remote sensing is used in climate change detection. And here you can see the heat indicators or indication of how hot Africa and the areas around the equator gets with the subsequent effects on species, humans, and on agriculture, for instance. So with these GIS tools, we can collect population data. And what can we do with population data? What we actually need is a spatial resolution of a population grid to understand the vulnerability of the people that live in certain areas. So in this regard, we collect information such as the sex, age, population density, and the children that live in that area. Because the death of children is often a very good indicator of poverty, for instance, and a lack of resources. This information will become very useful when you align this with other information and developmental tools. I will speak a bit about the alignment of this information in a moment. With regards to infectious diseases, such as we had with COVID-19 during the pandemic, this data and its development over time is of critical importance. You can trace disease characteristics, and you can see which portions of a population is affected more or less. You can see the infection rates, how it literally moves through populations, through continents. And by this, you can make certain predictions to distribute vaccines in a certain way or to allocate health resources to certain areas where the need for that is much higher. You can do the same with heat or extreme heat exposure, because extreme heat exposure will influence infrastructure such as farming and people likewise. People may be exposed or impacted by extreme heat exposure by mortality, diseases, and their health in general. Farming, for instance, may be impacted through its infrastructure, its labor output, and the growth of plants and the water needs of such plants. So by mapping extreme heat exposure, it is clear that you can anticipate certain issues and then manage and plan for it to counter the effects, or hopefully counter the effects of some of these consequences of extreme heat exposure. That will benefit both people, their health, minimize diseases and mortality, and improve farming labor output, and ultimately lead to food security. However, the problem in Africa, one of the problems in Africa, as you can see from the graph on your left-hand side, is a lack of weather station that hampers the collection of correct and timely heat data. You can see specifically that in the middle of Africa, where the biodiversity is at its densest, we do not have a lot of weather stations. So it's hard to predict the extreme heat exposure that those species are exposed to. And you can see if we could predict or have access to heat exposure or correct weather calculations or weather samples, we can use that to protect species or to at least preserve some of the species and to plan environmental actions going forward. Then again, with regards to heat exposure and the mapping of weather situations, it's important to make a distinguish or the difference between land surface temperature versus the temperature that radiates from buildings. And where people and species live with regards to this proximity, either on a land surface in an open area of in-between buildings where people live and work, and understanding how that impacts people living in a rural area as opposed to people living in an urban area where the tall skyscrapers literally trap heat in between buildings and its effect on people and their health. So we often lack high-resolution urban population data as well. And you can now see why it's important not only to map the weather conditions in a very, very fine manner, as well as the population data, and how if you can use both those types of maps and you overlay them across each other, the immense information that can provide to you for managing extreme weather conditions, both for people, species, and agriculture. So how can we use geospatial data to improve what we call environmental justice going forward? As I've explained to you, we try to combine the layers of geoinfographic maps. For example, you can combine a map mapping flood hazards with the social vulnerability maps to better manage disasters. In this way, you will know where and when to evacuate people. You will know from the population data whether they have transport needs so that you can send in enough transport or infrastructure and supplies, medical supplies, water, food supplies, safety tents, etc., to provide for the dislocation of a certain number of people by certain flood hazards. The same is true for infectious diseases. Infectious diseases spread in poor and the aged population has a worse outcome than those spreading in more people with better immune systems. So if you have those population data with people with pre-existing conditions that make them vulnerable to certain infectious diseases, you have a better idea of how to manage your health response and your medical supplies to a certain population and what type of medical supplies you need to get to them. That way you can better manage a pandemic and allocate healthcare resources accordingly without wasting money and time, which is often of the essence in a health emergency. With regards to crops, farming and food security, the crop position and health status, topography, soil type, fertilization, etc., can be mapped, and that will be an ideal tool to manage agricultural activities. And if you can manage agricultural activities in extreme heat conditions, you can secure or ensure food security, which is very, very important in Africa. Then you have heat and biodiversity maps to predict species' adaptation, their movements, and their extinction to help survive, or to sequence their genes to preserve species and investigate their characteristics. So this is where I want to come to the conclusion with using geospatial data to improve environmental justice. Part of environmental justice in Africa is to preserve the vast numbers of biodiversity we have on the continent. And if we use these geospatial maps and technologies together with the health information, population data, biodiversity data, etc., we can really gain some valuable insights into what we need to do to plan, preserve, and protect the valuable biodiversity resources we have in Africa. One of the projects that is aiming exactly to do that is the Africa Biogenome Project, of which I'm also lucky to be part of. They specifically want to build capacity and infrastructure to generate, analyze, and deploy genomics data for the improvement and sustainable use of biodiversity and agriculture across Africa. And the tools I'm talking about will be of immense value for them in this work that they do. They do technology development, knowledge exchange, and industry, but also include the socioeconomics, ethics, and policy issues, because as we said, that nothing happens in a vacuum or an island, and that biodiversity, climate change, and socioeconomics are all part of the entire ecosystem we all live in and the spaces we share on Earth. So they use genomics for the conservation of endangered and endemic species that, as I said before, evolution is not keeping up with climate change. So genomics may be one of the only ways in conserving endangered and endemic species going forward, which is a fantastic initiatives. They can also use these technologies to improve the health of crops and livestock and map the weather conditions and the heat exposure and changes in the weather to plan and manage crops and livestock environments going forward. And they use genomics and bioinformatic technologies for the agri-environment. So this is what they do at the moment. And this will absolutely lead to ultimately environmental justice, which is defined as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Thank you so much for listening.